In part one of Life, Evolution and the God Question, life in all its diversity. Human beings, the crowning achievement. Trying to explain. Charles Darwin and evolution by natural selection.
The idea that organisms, including us, all came from, as Darwin said, one or a few forms.
He was in no doubt that he had got something substantially correct about the way life on Earth works.
Natural selection is not an engine for changing creatures one to the other.
But it looks as if the further back in time we go, the smaller and simpler the organisms get.
Well, Darwin had no idea what DNA was, and yet his theory fits perfectly with the way that DNA molecules are transmitted.
But still controversial and provocative.
It appears to be an attack on the story of creation.
Evolution, raising the God question.
The very conception of God has been muscled off the scientific playing field.
One can be both a Christian and a committed Darwinian evolutionist.
This is basically science teaching us something about what was really happening with God's creative plan.
Ever since the publication of Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, evolution has been fundamentally important to atheism, and sometimes even presented as the intelligent alternative to belief in a creator.
In the case of evolution, we begin with something which seems fantastic. Darwin says, isn't it hard to believe that these exquisite adaptations could evolve by a process of natural selection? And then what the science does, it makes it explicable. What requires a supernatural explanation? All of the early versions of an intervening God have been rejected. I find nothing that cannot be explained by natural causes. But at the end, of course, it's still awesome. Evolutionists such as myself, we still say, wow.
Before Darwin came along, it looked perfectly obvious that even if evolution happened, there must be some guiding force to tell animals or plants how they ought to evolve. Natural selection is a blind force. The things that survive, survive.
But some scientists reject the Stark choice. They argue that Darwin is not a threat to belief and make the case for God and evolution.
I think one of the most common misconceptions that people have is somehow there's an inherent conflict between evolution and evolutionary theory and the idea of God. Now, all that theism, in its broadest sense, says is that the natural world and everything in it are ultimately the product of the work of a creator.
For Sir John Polkinghorne, a scientist and an Anglican priest, understanding Darwinian evolution deepens his appreciation of the mind and craft of the creator.
Creatures are allowed to be themselves, and indeed are allowed to make themselves. That's the theological way of thinking about the processes of evolution which have brought to birth the extraordinary fruitfulness with which the universe has been endowed. That's a much more satisfying picture of God, I think, than the sort of cosmic tyrant who has everything under tight control.
So it's in no way subverting the idea of creation that we have in Genesis 1 to 3. It's rather simply asking or answering a different kind of questions, answering the question, how did God do it? What are the processes that God used to bring all of those things into being?
Though he might not have intended it, Darwin ignited a major debate about God. The division between atheists and theists is clear, but among theists there is also some disagreement about the science.
I am a theist, and I'm also an evolutionist, because I think ultimately the evolutionary process exists in what a theologian would call God's providential plan. Now, how is that different from intelligent design? Really simple, and that is, I think that natural processes are necessary and also sufficient to bring about the origins of all living things, including ourselves. An intelligent design advocate thinks that natural processes are not sufficient to bring about these things and therefore require God's constant intervention.
It seems to us more compelling from an empirical, evidential point of view to say that we're looking at evidence of intelligence in the natural world, that you can actually see or detect that.
Evolution attempts to build, from the available evidence, a comprehensive explanation for the diversity of life. But inevitably, it demands an element of faith.
We don't know the whole story. We do know that you can go in there and modify genes directly in the laboratory and produce offspring that differ from each other in fundamental ways. So there's no reason to think it couldn't have occurred that way.
Amazing that something like the eye could have been produced by this process of natural selection. So yes, it's counterintuitive. But yes, everyone who studied it seriously has concluded that this kind of adaptive design can be explained on the basis of these natural processes.
We might find more data in the future that would counter some of these ideas. I think what we have to do is say, well, all the data we have at the moment points in this direction. The evolutionary account is the best explanation that we have to explain all the biological diversity that we see on the Earth today.
But not all are persuaded. Professor John Lennox remains doubtful about how adequately evolution explains all the diversity of life.
I find the biologists convincing on the level that this mechanism produces the kind of variations that Darwin saw, what might be called microevolution. I find it more controversial when it's claimed that this variation principle, natural selection, produces the major transitions.
Evolution is believed to work through a form of trial and error, changes in DNA building over billions of years. Somehow they have to combine to create advantages.
Now you can for the first time in the last 10 to 15 years, quantify how improbable those changes actually are.
Intelligent design scientists have tried to calculate how many random trials might be necessary to produce a definite biological success.
A mind-bogglingly large number, 1 in a trillion or so, sequences that are possible would perform a specified function. Can normal, natural mutations hit a target that is that small?
You've got to have a whole lot of things go right before natural selection can even operate. And the things that have to go right are so incredibly improbable that it's really not a plausible explanation to rely on natural selection and random mutation to produce the big changes.
I can only think of 2 possibilities, but I'm very open to someone else coming up with another one. One of these would be that the laws of physics themselves constrain these searches so that they are not actually random searches. The second way around this small target problem is intelligence.
Scientists with more faith in the evolutionary account respond by emphasizing what might be achieved given enough time.
It's an extraordinarily simple idea, a simple mechanism, but capable of efflorescing into great complexity, given time.
You often hear evolution described as being simply random evolution, as though anything can happen. And the reason people say that is because they say that mutations occur at random. Well, I, as a scientist, am always uncomfortable with the word random, because to me the word random implies you get anything. In reality, mutations are constrained. Evolutionary change is the result of an interaction between the laws of physics and chemistry and the constraints of animal and plant development. That means that change isn't just random. It's constrained by all of these forces.
And that explains why you don't get elephants flying. You know, they can't take off. I mean, there are certain constraints.
What is so difficult for any of us, myself included, is to really imagine the opportunity from 3,500 million years for natural selection and the other pressures in evolution to work.
In the world of technology, the claim that complex machines could evolve over time from simple machines without a designer is counterintuitive. Some argue that the same is true in the natural world.
Now, when people say to me, oh, but if you have enough time, you know, surely you could make a huge variety of creatures, my thermodynamic expertise kicks in. I'm saying even if you've got an existing simple machine, you cannot develop that into a more complicated machine. And you cannot do that without an intelligent system coordinating all the structure such that it all moves forward in an organized way.
Our view is that there is actually positive evidence for design in nature, and particularly in biology, and therefore there is evidence that, while not proving the existence of God, certainly provides support for that belief.
While arguments continue about how much evolution really explains, a fundamental mystery remains: the origin of life itself. Scientists believe that before life began, Earth abounded in the essential raw materials for life: ocean, atmosphere, rocks and minerals. Energy was also available in many forms. But how all of this led to the development of molecules that could copy themselves and progress the development of life remains uncertain.
The problem of life's origin is an immense problem. And without that, to start the ball rolling, Darwin's theory is fundamentally incomplete.
There's lots of interesting speculation. Much of it is empirically informed, but we really don't have the evidence that we need to have a very compelling scientific story about how life originated in Earth.
Every living cell, including the very first on Earth, is built using the information in its DNA. The question is how that information could have originated.
The tremendous amount of engineering and information and action that has to go on to get even one cell to exist is absolutely astonishing. It's like looking at the whole universe in miniature, and that's just one cell.
It has to have accumulated by pre-cellular evolution by natural selection. That's the most obvious process to look at.
The argument of evolution by natural selection has so far survived every challenge that can be made to it by evidence or by analysis. Everything works and is explicable if you believe in it. Nothing works if you don't.
My own view is that the amount of information that's needed to get life going, even though we now know it's a lot, did indeed happen through natural processes. But I have to be honest, in a sense, and I hope my words are understood here, there's a certain element of faith in that.
You can shuffle chemicals and you can fill the universe with some kind of primordial soup and shuffle it for the whole age of the universe, and still you're not going to get life. Why? Because life has to do with a very special sort of thing called information. We know that natural processes can transmit information, but there's no evidence that they can originate it.
When we find information in the cell, this is not something that Darwinian evolution can explain. But we do have an explanation that is known to produce information, and that explanation is intelligence.
It's not just to do with physics and chemistry. It cannot be. Take the DNA code. It's effectively a language. It's hardly surprising that in that incredible opening chapter of John chapter 1, it says, "In the beginning was the Logos," which is effectively saying, in the beginning was the message. A lot of branches of science, you don't need to worry about the idea of where did it all come from. But if you're going to do origins science, then in my view, you cannot make this presupposition that there is no mind out there, that there is no God.
For now, the scientific origin of life remains a mystery. But even somehow, with all the chemical processes in place to produce it, it might never have survived if planet Earth hadn't provided so many life-encouraging conditions. Perhaps by chance, perhaps by intention.
The human species is very lucky to have the environment that we have on planet Earth. Human life could not exist on Mars, it could not exist on Venus. In fact, if you just move the Earth 1 million or 2 miles away or closer to the sun, we probably would have a much different climate, and human life as we know it would not exist.
One of the most amazing things about planet Earth is that it's stayed in a very narrow range of temperatures from about 4,000 million years ago till the present day, between 0 degrees centigrade when ice freezes and 100 degrees C when water boils off and would be lost into space. And that's quite remarkable actually, because that's what supports life as we know it. If it weren't for that, we wouldn't be here.
What we observe of planet Earth is mostly on the surface, but deep within its core are forces which continuously shape and reshape the world, allowing life to continue.
Planet Earth, it generates its own heat on the inside. As that heat reaches the bottom of the crust, it actually pulls the continents with it. And with the pulling of continents, they collide with one another, they create mountains, they create ocean basins, and there you've created all the environments where we find life today.
If, in fact, this universe, never mind the Earth, were not just the size it is, the age it is, the conditions it is, life couldn't exist. And so that's just happenstance, that's just chance. We wouldn't be here to know about it otherwise. That's one way of looking at it. Or the other way is you can say, yeah, well, there was a purpose behind this. If you believe in a God, then maybe he made it this way. Or he enabled it to become this way so that life could exist. Science actually can't tell you the difference between those two answers. But certainly if you believe in God, everything about this earth is completely consistent with that, isn't it? Certainly not inconsistent with it.
So Darwin is part of the story, but he isn't the whole story. And there is still a fundamental question: why is the world the way it is? Why is it so richly potential, so that a universe that started as a ball of energy is now the home of saints and scientists? That seems to me to be a question that remains.
Despite the challenges to it, evolution remains the most widely accepted scientific account of how life developed on Earth. But for those who hold firm to evolutionary biology and also have faith in God, there are some significant challenges to face. Professor Michael Ruse has studied them in detail.
Can a Darwinian be a Christian? Yes, but it's not easy, but whoever said the important questions in life are easy. Clearly, you can't be a Darwinian and believe in a very old Earth and at the same time be what in America is known as a young Earth creationist. In other words, somebody who believes in 6,000 years and 6 days of creation. I mean, those are just incompatible. So, sure, at that level there's going to be a clash. The kind of solution that were I a Christian, I would favour would be something very much along these lines. God creates through law rather than instantaneously, miraculously. It's not saying there are no miracles. One is saying, though, the miracles are not necessarily boom, 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 but much more the miracle of the whole thing unfurling.
Plenty of people say, oh, of course there's a God. He set up the laws of physics. He set up the laws of biology, he set up the laws of mathematics. But that seems to be such a futile and empty thing to say. I mean, what are you trying to say? That idea is of no help at all in understanding mathematics, in understanding biology, in understanding life. It's just not a helpful idea. I don't see the point of it. If you want to believe it, fine, but don't ask me to believe it too.
The problem that the non-theist has is ultimately, how do you account for nature itself? Do you believe that nature is simply self-explanatory? And the answer that I give is no, I don't think so.
But even if it can be argued that the Creator is the author of the laws of nature, does the evolutionary process itself really look like the work of a good and loving God?
If, as it does, Darwinism works through a struggle for existence, then, and it does, then clearly you're going to have struggle, you're going to have violence, you're going to have death. Often the death is going to be very painful.
God works through evolution. I mean, if that turns out to be true, then it's yet one more piece of evidence for God being malign. Because the mechanism of evolution is so cruel.
98%, perhaps 98.9% of all species ever to have appeared on Earth have become extinct, which I think would make the designer seem either very clumsy or very malign, or perhaps both.
I would chastise him for choosing such an evil way of propagating his wishes on the Earth, of as natural selection.
The question of God and suffering is one of the most challenging for believers.
Everything that lives will eventually die. Death is simply a part of life. It's not an act of cruelty. It's the generative power of life, birth, reproduction, culminating ultimately in death, that produces the evolutionary process and produces the grandeur that is in life itself.
There can never be a full theological explanation of that suffering. There can only ever be a theological response, that in order for the natural world to be really free and allow for free will in humans, we had to allow for this kind of suffering to take place.
God is not a sort of cosmic tyrant who is going to produce simply a cosmic puppet theatre in which God pulls every string. God is not going to be in total control of everything, create a machine-like world. And the reason for that is we believe that the nature of God is love, and the nature of love is to give due freedom and independence to creatures, to the objects of love. So God brings into being a world that is reliable, which God, I believe, interacts with in its unfolding history, but does not determine everything that happens.
One could argue then that inasmuch as God is going to create, he had to create through natural selection, and so then at some level the pain and suffering are part of a package deal.
I certainly don't think that the ordinary conditions of life are so cruel that evolution inherently conflicts with the idea of a good and gracious God.
Another area where I would want to say you've got to work pretty hard at it is over the whole existence of humankind. It seems to me that absolutely central to the Christian message or the Christian belief is that we humans are made in the image of God, that at some level we had to be.
So if God's eventual purpose was to create human beings, it appears he could have been largely relying on chance. Evolution gives no guarantees.
Had a comet not hit the Earth 65 million years ago, the dinosaurs would not have been wiped out, so the mammals would not have been able to take over, and so probably we wouldn't be here. We owe our existence literally to our lucky stars.
There is absolutely no evidence of any kind, of any forethought or design or plan or architecture in evolution. I've used the phrase that evolution is a series of successful mistakes.
I think God's creative plan included in his image, and by that I mean image of mind, not necessarily of body, because I don't think God has a physical body like ours, but certainly had the explicit intention of bringing into being spiritual creatures.
In other words, put your trust in the Supreme Being and his initially benign plan for us, and that's all you need to do. That's an insult to what we have of intelligence.
I don't think for a minute it was laid down from the beginning the five-fingered Homo sapiens in our special way, specific way, was going to come into being. But that beings of our complexity and consciousness were going to eventually to emerge somewhere in the course of history, I think, was built into the universe from its very beginning.
There's a popular belief that through evolution, creatures inevitably become more complex. Consequently, if the story of life were rerun, it's likely the outcomes would be broadly similar to those we see today.
Evolution does end up with organisms that are intelligent, and in that sense, if you reran the tape of life, you would end up with a lot of intelligence. And I suspect if you had enough time, you'd probably end up with creatures, even if they look rather different to us, that ended up having discussions about the nature of an almighty.
I don't see anything about our biology that is essential to the message or to the work of a creator. I think intelligence and reflective self-awareness is what matters.
But a further challenge to theists who embrace evolutionary biology is how they reconcile their science with the Genesis account of the origin of life.
Genesis is history, which describes not only creation in 6 literal days. Genesis is primarily telling me where I come from. It's giving me an understanding as to how to look at origins. And it's saying, without a shadow of a doubt, that God literally took the ground, and out of it made Adam. That he literally took out of Adam and made Eve.
You can't put that together with what science is teaching us about the universe. The universe is much older than that. The way in which life came about can't be explained in that fashion.
It's one of the mistakes that people make who try and read Genesis 1 and 2 as if it was a scientific account of 6 days of hectic divine activity, is that they are actually misusing Scripture. They are reading something that is really a theological piece of work, and they're treating it as if it was a scientific work. And that's an abuse of Scripture.
All of physics, along with biology, goes down if you're going to really challenge the scientific evidence for the antiquity of the universe and the earth and evolution.
You've got to accept that the days had to be regarded in an ordinary sense as 24-hour days. Evening and morning, wherever it's used in the rest of Scripture, is always meaning an ordinary 24-hour day.
Is it actually what the Bible says? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. When was that? Day one, but the text doesn't say so. In fact, many theologians would argue that in the beginning is not day one. The Bible doesn't insist that the earth is young. And then these days, the very first mention of the word day in Genesis, the Hebrew word yom, then God called the light day and the darkness he called night. Now the very thing that is not is 24 hours. It's less. It means the portion of daylight as contrasted to the dark. The word day appears again, and then we get day one, and God said. Day two, and God said. It doesn't take God very long to speak, but that there could be vast periods of time between those utterances. And that what Genesis is talking about on a simple schema is something actually very profound, that God doesn't do everything at once. He feeds in an input of information which then begins to unravel and realize all its potential. So for me, I do not feel obliged to share the young earth view and therefore run absolutely contrary to science unnecessarily. I think we've got to take both sides seriously. And that's what I try to do.
So I don't think that Genesis is set up in order to be a scientific account. It's set up for a completely different purpose, and that is to affirm a God who is the God of salvation, but also the Creator God. Understanding who God is as Creator is entirely compatible with evolutionary accounts.
Nevertheless, for those who interpret Genesis metaphorically, there remains the puzzling question of where in the evolutionary process Homo sapiens emerged as spiritual beings.
One way of understanding what's going on is actually that God did choose some Near East farmers, maybe a couple, maybe Adam and Eve of the Genesis account, if you like, whom he brought into fellowship with himself maybe 8,000 years ago. There were other modern humans around, there were other farmers around, but God chose a community of people to come into fellowship with himself and to know his will and to receive commandments from himself, if you like, to receive his image.
In the New Testament, it actually says to you, Genesis is history. And the Apostle Paul, just to confirm it, says that Adam was first formed, then Eve. In other words, he builds a whole doctrine on understanding the historical basis of creation. 1 Corinthians 15. It clearly teaches that death came in through Adam's sin. It really all hinges upon no death before the fall.
Adam was warned by God in the Garden of Eden not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of fruit and evil. He was warned that on the day he ate of it, then he would surely die. Genesis chapter 3, we find Adam and Eve disobeying God. We read of this amazing account of them being cast out of the Garden of Eden, a most vivid picture of spiritual death. But they didn't drop dead. And so they actually lived for hundreds of years and went on to have lots of children. And Paul's chapters in 1 Corinthians 15, we can interpret that as Adam's sin leading to our spiritual death, leading to that alienation from God that needs to be restored in Christ. And I think providing we take the text as a literary theological text and not as telling us science, then we'll really get a hold of what it's trying to say to us.
If I took you to
For many on both sides of the debate, the six-day creation story and the evolutionary timescale can never be reconciled. But a lead researcher at London's Natural History Museum believes he has discovered an intriguing relationship between Genesis and evolution, so bringing a new perspective to a controversial subject.
The first page of Genesis is a creation account, and it has a number of steps in it. The people that wrote it had no biological training, yet they've managed to get the evolutionary history of life on Earth, as well as the cosmological history, absolutely perfectly correct. You begin with the let there be light, the universe in general, I suppose. You then move on to the sea is forming, which again is what happened in the history of the universe and the Earth. Then you go on to the evolution of life, but specifically plants. And following that, you've got this great explosion of evolution that occurred in the sea. In the Cambrian, life was exclusively marine. And then we get life moving on to land. So everything's there in the right order. I mean, the question I would have is, would the writer of that first page of Genesis have known about any of these events? Well, absolutely not. So why would he write such a thing? I fully accept everything that's been written in science. I understand how it's been rigorously tested and tested again. Yet, I'm starting to find space for God.
The story of life on our fertile planet is awesome and wonderful. As a picture is built of the underlying processes, controversies emerge about science, about evolution, about God. But the ultimate decision to be made is whether or not the undoubted success of life is attributable to a creator.
There's a lot of things here that make strong atheism actually the least rational of all the choices.
The reason that we live in a universe that is just bursting over with evolutionary possibilities for life is because that universe is ultimately the work of a creator who wanted it to be so.
I guess I would accuse God of having played a malicious trick in providing all the evidence that he didn't exist.
And the only evidence I would be able to adduce that God existed was that I'd had a vision that told me that God existed.
I find personally atheism to be intellectually incoherent. Well, this planet certainly looks as if it has a purpose. Why go against something which seems so obvious to so many people?
Here am I, 4.5 billion years after it all started here on Earth, that I'm able to sit here talking about Darwinism. Does that prove the existence of God? No, I don't think it does. I'm a skeptic. I don't have an answer.
I am an atheist, not an agnostic. And do I worry that I'm wrong? And the answer is no.
Evolution without God is too good to be true.
There's another entity in the universe besides matter and energy, and that entity is mind. We ourselves have them. We know what minds can do.
But all I want to believe in is the truth. And I think at the moment, God seems like a reasonable answer.
We've got to accept the level of explanation that's got the maximum explanatory power, namely an intelligent God.
I regret that there is no God, because I think the closest I will get to immortality is through medicine, and I'll just have to put up with that, I'm afraid.
These are really exciting issues that I wrestled with 50 years ago, and thank God, at least in a metaphorical sense, thank God I'm still wrestling with them now. There you are, that's a proof for the existence of God.